Okay, with a slight delay due to technical glitches and overrunning sessions before us, we would like to start the DNS Quo Vadis session, and it is all about addressing challenges and the future functionality of the DNS. We have a lot of interesting speakers here who will help us to have a great discussion. And these are spread all over the room, so I hope I can find them all in time. We're starting with Alexandra Kurlikova, who's working for ICANN. Fiona, unfortunately, due to either voice over IP issues or something, cannot join us. Gregory Monnier is not here, but he is joining us via WebEx. He's working for Europol. Peter Koch over there works for DNS and the Internet Society. DNS, by the way, manages the... Oh, okay. I'm sorry. And DNS obviously is in charge of .de. David, I'm not sure where he's over there, is from Georgia and works for the Georgian Research and Educational Networking Association. The moderators will be Chris from RIPE, Jackie, who unfortunately isn't here because she got stuck in Zurich and will only arrive tomorrow, and myself, Lauren. Okay, so essentially this session is meant to be a very open discussion about, as it says in the title, what are the challenges and, you know, what will happen with the DNS going forward? We already see there's a lot of, you know, bits and bobs where things are working, sometimes they're not working. We are seeing potential challenges ahead in terms of geopolitics, in terms of technology, and also in terms of like how we can deal with abuse, so monoglyph attacks and all that kind of stuff is becoming more and more common. And our idea to kind of start this off was for every one of the key participants to give a short statement about what they see as the kind of key challenges here and how this might be resolved, which will be about 3 to 4 minutes per person. And then we'll open up, speak to the audience, see what's going on. Unfortunately, we have some trouble with dementi.com, so I'm not sure if we'll be able to use it later on. Alexandra, if you would start.
When we planning to fish for wishes first?
Hmm?
When we're supposed to ask for wishes first?
No, this is after your presentation.
Oh, okay. I think I'll start from a really high-level statement that probably that works. That probably the internet of today is the result of so-called network effect. If you go to Wikipedia, it will probably tell you that that means an increased effect from the number of participants of a particular ecosystem. And in our case, this effect encourages basically an infrastructure on which all the innovative applications and services are based. ICANN's role in the internet, as we know, is specifically to facilitate and support the network effect, which is based on names and numbers, which basically now allows us to connect a few billion people, and we're still hoping that more will join. However, this network effect has its own consequences. It means that we need a really low common denominator, which somewhat discourages autonomy or basically it promotes this dumb network which needs to be running, and sometimes the intelligence and innovation is actually on the edges, and it is facilitated by different actors which use the same dumb network, so to speak. And this is what has brought us to the internet of today. The benefits of such a structure, of such a design, probably have still been compelling, since we're still using the DNS, we're using the internet as it is. And what? Okay. the question is how strong the pressures on the system are, which might change it or not. So if you think about DNS itself, at least as a protocol, because there are various ways how we can look at DNS. We can look at it as a basis for different applications, as an area of registration services. But if you look at the protocol itself, it's really old. It's over 30 years old. And one of my colleagues didn't want me to bring this up, but I will say this, that in one of the recent IETF meetings, there was this question brought up, how resilient DNS can be, given that it actually features in over 185 RFCs. So we keep patching it and improving and building and overbuilding. And since it was built so many years ago, it didn't think, or those who created it didn't think much about security, about privacy and other matters, which clearly from this event fill the room. And that's how we have now working streams looking at DNS over TLS, DNS over HTTPS, etc. We find new applications for DNS, as in one of the presentations earlier today was explained, Oxford Flood Network or something like this. I think it was in Peter's presentation from Peter from Center. The protocol clearly evolves, and at the same time, there are new identifier systems. There are new innovative ways of communication. And at ICANN, we are looking and we are monitoring, and those brand new worlds coming up. Those who are frequenters to ICANN meetings might have noticed that we normally, every now and then, we run a session on emerging identifier systems. We have looked at, upon request from the community, we have looked at DOAR, we have done research into blockchain, there are other things coming up. But keeping an eye on what's coming up and what's the next so-called iPhone, which will break the paradigm, we're still responsible about what keeps the current internet as we know it. And the core mission of the organization, as all of you, well, the majority of you know, is the stability and resilience of the system as it is now. So I hope this hasn't sounded too over-optimistic, but I think that cumulatively there is still faith in the DNS, the protocol, the underlying protocol as it is now. But clearly there will be more and more challenges, and not only technical, but also legislative, and we will probably have an opportunity to talk about this. I'll stop now. Thank you.
Okay. So as the next participant, it would be nice if Gregory could maybe speak to the challenges from a law enforcement perspective. I hope it will work well, but we can see you, Gregory, and I hope you can hear us as well. Excellent.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So my name is Greg Meunier. I'm working at Europol and the European Cybercrime Center. In terms of a few remarks about how the law enforcement community sees the DNS, in general, we see that criminals and those who are into doing dirty business online are very frequently using the DNS as a protocol, and in particular, they're using the vulnerabilities in the DNS to carry out their activities. We see that a number of investigations we're working on have been facilitated by aspects such as DNS, and there are many different malwares that are targeting either the browsers of end users or the name servers or even the registrars. They're changing the DNS settings so that they can transfer the traffic to malicious servers. We've also seen criminals using the DNS to hide their traces. If you think, for instance, about the fast flux or double fast flux techniques, that was, for instance, used for the Avalanche network. The criminal infrastructure was there for about 9 years. We couldn't see it. It took us about 4 years to investigate it, take it down, because it was using the DNS to hide the IP addresses of the servers sustaining the infrastructure. The DNS can also be misused for more aggressive techniques, such as launching DDoS attacks. So there is a known technique which is called the DNS amplification attacks. So there are many ways of using the DNS and the vulnerabilities in the DNS to carry out criminal activities online, spread malware, steal personal data, and basically resist law enforcement intervention. So I think it's important to argue for strengthening of some security measures around the DNS. DNSSEC is very good. It prevents domain hijacking, domain shadowing as well, that are aspects that are used a lot by criminals for malicious registrations of domains. But then, of course, we get into the issues such as DNS over TLS or DNS over HTTPS, which is the new trend. If you go to IETF now, most of the discussion on DNS are about these new protocols. These are great, but at the basis of such measures, of course, you've got the encryption questions. And this is really a double-edged sword, because the privacy that DNS over TLS provide to the users will also be used by attackers to extract information that has been stolen from a network, for instance. So there's no real definitive answers, but I just wanted to stress that from the law enforcement perspective, yes, I agree with the previous speakers that DNS is an old protocol and there are many vulnerabilities that are being abused by criminals. But then, of course, when we try to strengthen the protocol and make it more secure, then, of course, there is the issue of law enforcement and prosecution becoming a little bit blind. So that's just, I'm throwing this around for discussion, and happy to continue the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gregory. And according to my list, it would be Peter next with his introductory points. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren, and good afternoon, everybody. Let me continue maybe with some points that have already been raised. One is the theme of complexity. Indeed, the protocol is kind of old. It has been developed and evolved over time. But then at some point in time, engineers start to get into playing mode and add features here and there in bells and whistles, which is okay, which we have survived with many other protocols, but the DNS is kind of suffering from its own success in this regard, because it is at the core, the very core of the internet infrastructure. And like every good operator, I tend to have a conservative approach to this. Like necessary changes, but not necessarily all the features that people envision. In that regard, we do have DNSSEC, which adds important security aspect. Now the IETF and people around there are working on privacy for the DNS, which is obviously necessary, because if anybody remembers this young man called Snowden, we learned from his revelations that there is metadata being exploited coming out of the DNS. So the response in terms of privacy and encryption is interesting, although people should be aware that this is a long way to go, because the challenge is as big, at least as big as deploying DNSSEC for the security, which adds to the complexity again, and then also makes some people believe that the protocol isn't ready. Now, in Germany, I'm pretty sure in other countries, we have these famous cathedrals, one of which is the Cologne Cathedral, which is never ready, and if it should be ready any time, then sky will fall. So we keep building it and repairing it, so on and so forth, which is probably true for infrastructure elements in the internet as well. What we also see, and that is slightly related to this topic, is that protocols like the DNS, and we also have the core internet protocol, the IP protocol. Protocols that are at the very core of the internet are hard to upgrade in a way. So the move from v4 to v6 is not easily regulated. It cannot be demanded. And as we don't have flag dates in the DNS, in the internet, as declaring tomorrow we will all switch to v6 or we will all deploy DNSSEC or privacy of the DNS. This is a big challenge. And the decision making around this, and the ICANN colleagues have carefully avoided the topic of DNSSEC key rollover, which for those who don't recognize the acronyms, doesn't matter, forget that immediately. But it is about an interesting question of decision and policy making, which is, so we are going to make some changes to the core infrastructure. We do know that we cannot reach out to 100% of the population. So how many are we willing to lose a bit on the way? I'm avoiding to say sacrifice because people won't be hurt, but there will be bumps in the road. And that's the question of how to make these decisions and how to get there is open and is unanswered, or is going to be answered on in flight, which is probably a challenge. I think the complexity topic I already mentioned, and then there is on a different angle, we do see a concentration on the side of the operations, which is slightly similar to another protocol that some people may remember, the protocol around email, so-called SMTP. In the early days of the internet, everybody was supposed to send email to everybody by sending from their own server to somebody else's server, until so-called email providers popped up, and everybody was only talking to their email providers, and the email providers were talking to each other, and then you ended up at the end user. We are seeing similar developments in the world of the DNS. We do have now 2,000 odd TLDs, but far, far less than those 2,000 registries. And we also have far, far less than 2,000 professional operators of DNS service. So there's a concentration there. And on the other hand, we see emerging a service that was taken for granted and everybody had it on their systems, the so-called resolving side. For those of you who attended the previous tutorial, that is the part that gathers the information from all the name servers in the world and compiles responses. And people are adding services to that. And you know all the fancy numbers like 8888, 9999, 1111. You can't continue. That only works for those three for the moment, but there are a couple of others upcoming. There are features added, which again adds to complexity. But again, there's a prearranged scenario. We have now dedicated providers of the resolving service and other services, so not everybody is necessarily talking to everybody else anymore. That changes the game, as it did change the game in the email world, because in today's world, if you start running an email server on your own, you'll soon find out that you can't really reach everybody else anymore. So this is not really end-to-end, fully transparent internet, and we need to be aware of that and take that as a challenge. And then, of course, there is regulation, and regulation isn't necessarily bad, isn't necessarily good, but it should be well informed from the technical and operational perspective, as well as long-term consequences and architectural influence and architectural consequences of maybe small changes that are implied. I think that's enough for an introductory statement, maybe more than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Now, it would be David's turn, who is also, I think, mostly in the engine room from what I've understood.
First of all, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I think the biggest challenges for DNS future and stability is still the security, which we are talking a lot about DNSSEC, which is still not implemented everywhere today. I think about challenges the privacy, collecting data, and so on. Government control, for example, you know the case that, for example, Russia is thinking to inventing, or I don't know, creating alternative domain name system or alternative internet. I don't know how they call, and what they will decide about this. We all know that DNS was invented quite a big time ago, more than 30 years, I think, yeah? And still it works very good, and it's quite a good protocol. But there are still the problems with the what I want to mention, that I have the impression that it's like a bit forgotten. So it's not paying much attention in terms of development of this protocol, and it became that alternatively there are other developments in terms of the alternative DNS services. There are talks about blockchain, how DNS can be can work with the blockchain technology. But still, I think for me, I think the most biggest challenge is DNSSEC, which was also presented quite a big time ago, but it is still not implemented, and I don't know why. And in many countries, it's still under question why it is not operational and so on. So, yeah, I think this is the most challenges, I think, about the DNS.
Okay, thank you all. I think that was a good roundup from our speakers, and I think it sort of gives a good introduction to the topic here. Basically, the rest of the session, we're planning to have a bit more of an open discussion, so, well, responding to what's been said so far, and I'm sure coming up with some other questions and other topics. So I want to throw, well, maybe first to see if there's others in the audience who have not spoken who have questions that they'd like to throw in. And I'm looking to our remote moderator here as well. No, nothing? Okay, well, not seeing anyone throw their hands up, I would throw back to our speakers and say, do any of you have sort of responses to what you've heard from your fellow panelists here?
Yes, I think I have a couple of follow-ups on what my colleagues have come up with. Regarding KSK role, this is an interesting point, and there is no intention to hide anything here. Actually, I'm sure Peter is aware that there was a certain percentage at the beginning which was expected to fail the rollover. But then we didn't roll in the end. For those who are not quite aware of the story, in very simple terms, we didn't do it as planned last year on the 11th of October because due to new data obtained through research, the data that was not available before that, we realized that this percentage might be more than expected. So it was decided to hold on and spend a bit more time on research and on communication with the community. Actually, the new plan has gone through public consultation, which hasn't happened before for a process, for a project like that. And it has been a truly, it's not just an ICANN.org project, the KSK role, it's a truly community project from the very beginning, because signing the root was a community effort. And then the comment that we collected basically clearly said, go, or at least that was the majority. So we're going. And it's again planned for the 11th of October 2018. Yes, we do know there will be fallout, there will be certain failures, but that's the risk to take. And I guess one of the aspects of this project is actually to go through the mitigation efforts, and that's what the team is doing together with the community. And on the other issue of other internets, that's actually an interesting one. Indeed, there have been reports on Russia setting up its own DNS/internet, because the reports have been really confusing. And then another way of discussing this story was to talk about a BRICS internet. Regardless on whether these are speculations or an actual ongoing project, the best way to address this, I guess, is basically what I said from the very beginning. It's all about network effect. As soon as what we're using right now is not useful for the majority, people will go. At this point, what DNS offers is a service which is preferred by the majority. As soon as it's not good enough as a service, then I guess we will be switching to project XYZ, which would be a replacement. But For now, it's just about the excellence and actually fitting the goal.
Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, let me quickly respond to Alex just to clarify that. Of course, I did not mean to say that ICANN did anything wrong about this problem regarding the KSK rollover. The multitude of attempts to get feedback from the community is very much appreciated, and you can only live with the comments that you receive, which is hard to get because emojis are much more interesting than DNSSEC keys, and everybody has an opinion about that. Which actually is more or less reinforcing my point that the technical necessities for innovation in the infrastructure are a really, really strange topic, right? There's lots of people to be affected and only a fraction interested and maybe another fraction with certain overlap deep in the technical and other details. And I think that was the meta issue, that we might not see this only within the DNS, but also in other protocols, as long as they are buried in the infrastructure, hidden, and you said nobody notices, like it's taken for granted, and this for the innovation point. If I may, I was going to go to another point, also to bring Greg back into the discussion. Bonsoir, Greg. And Greg, you said that there are so many vulnerabilities in the DNS, and that took me like a shock almost. Maybe we can discuss this a bit further, where these vulnerabilities are. I mean, I feel safe in using the DNS and all the servers and the infrastructure we provide. Many of us are providing critical infrastructures in the national regulatory environment, and so on and so forth. But I'm also sure that you didn't really mean that the vulnerabilities are at that technical level, are you?
No, exactly, Peter. What I meant is really there are many steps in the DNS resolving process which can be corrupted or influenced by criminal and malicious actors, and that's what we see regularly in our investigations.
So, okay, I mean, I think a question I might have for the whole group in talking about the sort of an older protocol that's sort of, well, either hasn't had much attention in technical terms or further development terms, or has, but then also looking at sort of the policy developing around it, and as Alexandra mentioned, perhaps legislative challenges here. Would all of you different individuals see a priority in terms of the DNS going forward, in terms of what's going to be the challenge or what needs to be fixed, as a technological challenge or more in the policy space? So do we need to, is the DNS itself going to have to be further developed, further improved, further fixed, or is it more about further improving the processes that we as a community and as the internet community have around how we use the DNS? Anyone, any thoughts? Please.
Yes, I know a little bit. My hobby is trains, and in order to change software on a train, it takes you about 2 years until you get the new feature, and you will never ever get an emoji on the screen on the train driver. It's not needed feature. So we are critical infrastructure in the meantime, and we need to change our thinking on what we do with it. No features anymore.
Marco, you want to?
Yeah, you were going into the same territory I was thinking. I would like to rephrase your question a tiny bit. Is the problem, if there is a problem, the problem people express with DNS, is that really the protocol, or is that the content inside the protocol?
I would even extend that question a bit further than that, because it is.
At some point, we're going to have to answer.
Yeah, there's enough space in the room. It is probably not even the content in the protocol. It is the content beyond the protocol, which is like the use, or at some point in time, I would say the abuse of the identifier system to do content regulation, which is probably the elephant in the room. The elephant doesn't have much space, though. But that is something we might want to put on the table. I think that there are technical challenges, and we can go back to the complexity topic, which is definitely an interesting question, because the stability and the ability to operate systems in that heavily distributed environment, including maintaining change and being able to maintain the protocol over time, are dependent on some stability of the technical layer. That is not a danger in the moment, but we've had in the IETF, and this is of course very blunt engineers talking about big problems when there is a single bit that they can't agree on, which is okay in that space, but should be carefully translated in a sphere like this. So nothing to see here, move on. No, but seriously, there is a technical complexity challenge at some point in time, but that, from my point of view, doesn't really influence or challenge the stability now or in the foreseeable future. The regulatory influence and demands that go in the direction of the domain name system and the players around that, as in content regulation or access regulation by the DNS, are making me much more nervous.
Alain.
Alain, I think we need to be careful when we talk about the complexity, because we need to dissociate the complexity of a protocol, the complexity of the operation of a protocol, and the complexity of the software that is used to deploy this technology. And one of the issues is that a lot of the software has been public domain software, open source, that has been developed by places that have suffered from underfunding for many, many years. And that has necessarily led to quality of software may not always be what we would like it to be. So sometimes we talk about, the camelback and breaking things by adding more features, and I hear calls for no more features, when actually it's more of a problem of the software that is not developed according to the most modern technologies. And that may be where we want to focus the attention. By that I mean putting money on the table to solve that very problem, because we cannot simply deploy critical infrastructure on underfunded piece of software.
Okay, any response? Mani?
Tapani Tarvainen. Not quite responding to that point, but something you mentioned earlier come up here. There's centralization of things, the number of servers going down. It's not quite as bad as you say. I'm one who I run both email server and DNS server at my home. It still works, it's doable, but it has become more difficult over time. Yes. So the question is, does this centralization, people starting to use more and more, say, Google for the resolver, pose a problem in itself, a danger in itself, that we are dependent on just a few companies and just a few software solutions? I run my DNS service, runs bind, and the other one runs NSD, just to have different software to avoid a probability of fatal bug in one. But all this centralization makes putting all your eggs in one basket, in a sense. So you see this as a problem, danger.
I think Marco's got a comment. I'm actually that's an interesting comment, given some other discussions that have been going on. I know at the recent RIPE meeting, Yariako gave a presentation on work that the IAB, the Internet Architecture Board, is doing on consolidation more in the industry than on necessarily specific tools. But I think that there is that question of sort of greater risk because of heavier reliance on few protocols or few tools or few companies, rather than the diversity that we always try to talk about as sort of a strength of the internet. But so that's possibly an interesting parallel there. But Marco, if you want to.
Yeah, I think Alain raises is a good point in terms of cost, and you made a comment like it works, and I think that's important bit to understand that for a lot of people outside, they just type in a URL and it works. They don't see the DNS, they don't experience the DNS. And there was some interesting research done in the Netherlands, and for instance looking at DNSSEC. Why isn't DNSSEC being picked up? And they looked at it, and a lot of providers sell it as a very premium service. The prices between a DNSSEC secure domain and the regular DNS domain went sort of like double. And we're trying to encourage people to use DNSSEC because we can use it as a building block for other technologies. But at the same time, you're trying to explain people to spend money on stuff they don't really see. And I think that's also part of the problem with the software in general. We're asking people to spend money on stuff they don't see. Am I right?
I'd like to pick up on that. It seems that it's more a generic problem. We have gotten used to free, but there's no such thing as free. Somebody has to pay for it. So in the case, we see DNS as mostly free for the community, but somebody else has to pick up a tab. And it's not going to be solved by advertisement.
Can't help reminding that the HTTPS or SSL in websites has gone up dramatically after Let's Encrypt make it free, basically. So I'm not sure if I can think of anything comparable for DNSSEC, but it might be worth thinking.
Well, there was this initiative by the Dutch domain registry to give a small discount to people if they sign their DNSSEC domain. That was a particular incentive to larger ISPs to just sign all their customer domains, but I'm not sure how far you can take that in the beyond that.
Hearing Marco, there's one thing that just flashes to my mind. You said you type in a domain name and you get to that to get domain. Well, actually, this is not always the case. We had also, even in the past, one macro case when this was not working, and that is given. That is because there are some creative ways that whoever is in between the user and the DNS interprets their right to twist the DNS. I'm thinking, for instance, one macro case was the wildcard that was introduced by VeriSign a few years ago that then generated such a big events that basically the Security and Stability Advisory Committee was started having a role exactly for this. But I'm also thinking now when you on a browser you type a domain name, you are fairly often the browser does not interpret that as a domain name, but as a string to push to Google, so that let Google guess what you really wanted instead of that domain name. So I think that this is, at least from my point of view of a user of the internet, this is a serious problem. So I don't know how to frame this problem, but is I would say the creative way in which somebody that is in between believes that they know better than the user what the user wants.
Greg, I saw you. Are you interested in diving in there? No, that's it.
No, sorry, absolutely. No.
I'm not sure. Peter, do you want to?
Yeah, I think the question you asked about the concentration and whether or not that is a problem. Maybe not immediate, but the question is, of course, together with all the other centers of gravity that we see, which also interestingly address the ability to upgrade or change infrastructure or change parameters at scale. Like if you have if you have your hands on an operating system that is run by, say, 1 billion or 2 devices on the planet, you can apply changes quicker than ever before and quicker than anybody else. And if you control not only the end device, but if you also control the other side, that puts interesting challenges to all players in the technical governance sphere and also in standardization. So from that angle, I think that's maybe not a problem, but something to very carefully look at.
Okay, so I would remind everyone in the room also that we're certainly open for others than those around the table to dive in here. I guess one sort of taking it more high level and open question that I'd have, a theme here sort of seems to be the idea of this is a plane in flight and we're going to have to repair it while it's in flight. It's not something that is ever going to be easy or straightforward to do, and that situation becomes more extreme the more our society relies on the internet and the DNS elements of the internet there. The question, I guess, then is, are those structures that we have in place, and I'm certainly not just meaning ICANN, I guess the IETF, but I'm sure there are others, and there are certainly others involved there as well, are they sufficient, or are there improvements that are sort of understood as would be useful, or that people can come up with now or think of? Where do we go sort of in terms of how we actually manage what needs to be done or to maintain the DNS and help us move forward? Okay, I've killed the conversation. Excellent. That's why I'm the moderator. And with that, I'll hand back to Lauren.
Well, okay. So with that question not really working out, let's try another one. So we have been talking a lot about the technical side of things, like how do we fix the stuff in flight? How do we deal with protocols? Is it still fit for purpose in some ways, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe it would be interesting to talk about, you know, the issues we kind of mentioned in the beginning. So what's the role of the DNS when it comes to abuse? What can be done there to potentially make things work better in the future? We all know there are ways, as Gregory, for example, did tell us about how it's being abused at the moment. So maybe that would be an interesting thing where we can think about, like, how can the DNS be more supportive in stopping abuse?
Well, this might sound counterintuitive a little bit, but from practice, yeah, okay. I just realized that from the practice of working in the region, from the engagement point of view, I think it's interesting how the problem of DNS misuse and abuse actually gives a vehicle and a platform for explaining how the system works. To those who are not necessarily trained to deal with the problem, and I'm sure Greg is more aware of this than anybody else, that there are many people whose job is to fight cybercrime, to actually deal with DNS abuse. They're not equipped technically or sometimes policy-wise to perform that job. And the problem itself becomes an opportunity to teach about DNS, about other protocols, about how the internet works. And that in itself, well, hopefully increases general and overall awareness about what challenges are on the table. It gives an opportunity to show a bigger picture, which goes beyond the internet regulation, inverted commas, of a given country, and shows how that fits into a bigger picture of the global internet governance, who the players are, what their roles are, how can you be more efficient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's sort of a backwards logic maybe, but it serves a purpose, which is essentially more knowledge, more understanding, especially for those who need that knowledge for their day-to-day job.
If I can jump in?
I always try to find another image for the same problem, and one is, what if DNS is like money? It's a needed thing, and money is used by legitimate users and it's used by criminals. There is no way of getting rid of it. It's basic infrastructure, it's there, it's neutral. DNS is basic infrastructure. It's there, it's neutral. It can be used by whoever it is. Why should that system be responsible for this? I don't understand that.
Okay, I think Greg tried to jump in, but can you try again, Greg?
Yes, that's a very interesting point Alex raised, and I think, and even the previous speakers, in the sense that yes, this is an infrastructure and it's neutral, it's there for everyone to use. But on the other hand, there are some policy and regulatory aspects that can be tricked around the whole system to try to reduce abuse. So of course, when we're talking about fast flux or DNS hijacking, it's slightly more difficult to prevent. But when we're talking about domain hijacking or simply domain registration abuse, then I think there are policies that can be pushed that would essentially reduce the rate of abuse. One of the main problems we have within the Public Safety Working Group of ICANN, so this group of law enforcement and public safety representative trying to engage with the ICANN community, one of the main challenge we have is really to push for more monitoring tools of abuse. Nowadays, the technology is there, the data is there. ICANN has established some kind of a pilot called DAR, where you can almost in real time measures the rate of abuse of some domains and some registrars and registries, and I think these tools are really essential because again, in our investigation, so you translate that in the normal world, then you see that very often domain names registration abuse is one of the enablers of cybercrime. It's just one of the techniques that is used all the time. Most of the botnets nowadays are using DGAs, and they generate random domains, and yes, registrar keep on letting those people to register those domains, and I think there are tricks that we can impose on the system so that it really gradually reduce the rate of abuse without stiffening too much competitions, and the DNS keep on working fine. But yes, I agree with your previous speaker. It's difficult to impose major technical changes to prevent, for instance, data corruptions or abuse of routers, firmwares, for instance, to do DNS hijacking. But in terms of domain names registrations, I think we've got a huge margin of maneuver to try to reduce abuse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. I think Peter indicated he wanted to say something.
Yeah, probably. So I think that I'm still struggling with this term, and I'm a bit in line with what Urs was just saying. What is happening that, of course, we do see criminal activity, malicious activity, and we see attacks and other kinds of bad activity on the internet. It is packets that are moved back and forth, and it's people behind that. And singling out the DNS is probably taking away the attention from the responsible parties. We do have, and Greg mentioned in his introductory statement very clearly, and you're right, there is DNS reflection attacks and so on and so forth, which is instrumenting the DNS to attack other systems in a different way than what you mentioned in your latest comment, though. We see the same happening, alas, with the time protocol and the management protocol. Still, nobody's talking about time abuse and management abuse and so on and so forth. We do know what the issues behind this are, and again, the issues are the core technical features of the internet, that the essentially a source address of an internet packet, like the sender of a postcard, can give false information about who sent the postcard. Because what is interesting is the addressee, the destination. This is how it works. There are measures underway to mitigate this quote freedom, and if more people would, more operators, and a critical mass of operators. So in vaccination and epidemics, there's the herd immunity that is important, and we do have the same thing here. Like if, and in most of the countries, people and operators are either encouraged or even regulated to make sure that their customers don't inject wrong source addresses. It would still not be sufficient because there could be other actors, and only if we reach a certain critical amount, a figure I cannot present, but it will be far more than 90%, then we mitigate this issue independent of whether it's the DNS, the time protocol, or others. So it's an internet problem. The reflection is an internet problem, and that DNS, the protocol, can be instrumented in that way is a technical question, and that also has found a couple of technical responses that can be addressed. So I think we can take that for dealt with. The other one is the registrations and looking at this and looking at Alain, because Greg mentioned the DAR project, which I guess I would encourage you to actually elaborate on. But, and after you've done that, I will talk about reputation and fact-based versus rumor-based decision-making.
Thank you, Peter. So we have two projects at ICANN that aims at essentially measuring the health of the system. So one is the DARF, which is a domain abuse monitoring system, and the other one is the Internet Technology Health Indicators. And we use part of the DAR data in the Internet Health Indicator project. The idea is we cannot really talk about the problem if we cannot size the problem. So we have to find a way to measure it. And the value that we have today, yes, may be interesting, but what's more interesting is the trend. Is it going down? Is the problem going down, or is the problem going up? So this is not about simply having a metric measure one time, but over time, over maybe 5 years, 10 years, saying what this trend is going to be. So the DAR project in particular is looking at registration in all the GTLDs and looking also at abuse that have been reported on anti-abuse lists, like commercial anti-abuse lists that are essentially reputation lists. And trying to see per 10,000 registration how many create problems. So essentially this is a percentage. What's a percentage in a particular the top level domain, GTLD, that show problems? And what we see is overall the vast majority of the top level domains have a very, very low score there. It's below 1%. It's really almost not visible on the map. But some of them are much higher up. So we have some graphs, some bubbles that I could show you if you're interested. And it shows that there is a concentration of some of those problems in some particular top-level domains. So this could be used as input to people setting up policies, saying, well, maybe you want to do something about that. So this comes beyond the realm of ICANN from an organization perspective, research perspective, to measure this, and moving into more an ICANN community policy development process to decide what to do with this. So I hope this is, Peter, a relatively good summary to answer the point that you raised.
Thank you very much. I guess we often see this problem when it comes to abuse and criminal behavior more generally, that the number of actual threat actors, for example, is actually very low, but they still cause a lot of trouble. However, it would be good if we could go back to Greg for the law enforcement perspective.
What I'd like to say with regard to DAR and even the study that was commissioned by ICANN very recently to compare the rate of abuse with the legacy GTLDs and the new GTLDs, exactly like the previous speaker said, the conclusion was that abuse was very much centralized or really on a few registrars and registries, and in particular there was one in China and one in the south of Europe. I forgot. But anyway, what was striking is that ICANN could not suspend both registrar, which had been proved to be really a systematic abuser, and the only one which was suspended was Nanjing in January 2017, and the reason for suspending it was not because of abusive practices, but because it didn't pay the ICANN fee. And so from a public policy perspective, I think there is a case to be made for ICANN to get a bit more power from the community to fight abuse more proactively and have the right legal base to suspend rogue registrars.
Thank you very much again for the law enforcement perspective. Maybe as we discuss this now, and I'm looking at the time, and obviously we want to finish roughly, on time for the buses. Maybe we could kind of come back to the issue of geopolitics, which is the other big one we kind of touched upon quite a bit in terms of like infrastructures breaking up, people kind of going off doing their own thing. And what I think would be interesting here, beyond what Alexander is saying about the network effects, as soon as too many people stop using something, it will just disappear. The question is, what are the implications for the DNS, but also, as Peter kind of mentioned before, what is actually behind it? So how might this work out if it actually came to be? Not sure who would like to comment. Okay, I just wanted to joke that, well, Chris had a go at breaking the discussion. Now I had one as well. So what I was wondering about is essentially if we would really see, say, a country breaking off the DNS, doing their own system in addition or as a replacement, how do you think would that work out? Do you think the population would follow this? How would this have to work in that state to work? We have someone in the audience. Wait, I'll give you a microphone.
My answer will be very simple. Do not mix up what media says on RT or CNN. There is no technology alternative to DNS for a simple reason. It must be supported all over the world. Otherwise, there is no use. I mean, this is not a political thing. This is a usability thing. I mean, that's it. Simple.
Well, that simple issue can be sort of circumvented. Let's say that some country decides that they don't want DNS to be used. They could set up one of the local relay that picks up the DNS and filters it as they like and provides a similar service inside the country for their people. Well, screw them. Yeah. So, but the reason why somebody might want to do that is basically just for censoring or filtering or other purposes, that they show the piece of the DNS space they want to show. I'm not sure it would be a sensible way to do it, but would be technically doable.
Well, actually, if they want to do that, they don't need to change the protocol. They just have to put the filters in place, and that's what they already are doing.
You just remember the story of the alternate route movement in the early 90s. So if you have 5 billion users, then it could work. But it takes a lot of time to get 5 billion users.
So how about 1 billion in China?
I do not know any Chinese initiative. The Chinese people are not stupid people. And they know that the DNS works, and that's it.
And here comes maybe an additional response to your question about how what consequences this concentration might have, because in a world of centralized resolver services, it's more or less the resolver operator who decides which top-level domains are important and which are not. So that's an interesting shift in power, because, and we don't see that for the first time. We see this in the world of web browsers, where essentially the vendor of the web browser decides which certificate authority you trust. And we see this, or we could see this, I need to phrase this very carefully now. We could see that the operating system vendor makes decisions about which root zone to use, right? So, because it's, while ICANN is important and we have this whole multi-stakeholder community around it, discussing the content of the root zone, translated into what is a top-level domain and what isn't. If a larger population walks away or is walked away into a different territory, then they vote with their feet, or somebody else votes with their feet.
Thank you very much.
One person.
I didn't see, but go ahead.
You know, want to indeed what Peter says, and that's probably also a call to vendors to provide transparency. There are now even browsers who just basically ignore all the system settings and do their own resolving to their own systems, and that's, I think, that would be wise to create a bit more transparency on the point that either stick with the system defaults or make clear to the user you're ignoring the system defaults.
Actually, there's even one more layer now where we see application bypassing the system, bypassing the default, the configuration, and the public DNS, essentially using their own internal infrastructure to do all this. And it's another potential shift in power, as Peter was mentioning before, where you see more concentration in a system that is walled off by those application vendors or platform vendors.
We do have an additional remote comment from Olivier.
So I must read it out. Alternative DNS root services have been proposed ever since we moved from ARPA host file to the DNS in the last 80s. Today there are still many alternative routes. There is link given in this message. Yes, none of them appear to be particularly successful. The root server system, as it currently is based on trust. Trust that root operators have from ISPs and end users. Some alternative root server proposals have bordered on the downright bizarre. And there is link given.
Okay. Again, I'm watching the time, making sure that all of you will get to the social event later on. So I would like to open the floor for like 2 more questions, maybe, if there are any.
Yeah, I just want to make an additional comment because somebody mentioned that one other development could be bypassing the system. I think there is the so-called handle system, which is managed by the Donau Foundation in Geneva, has the potential to, probably on top of the DNS or next to the DNS, to introduce another identifier system. So insofar, I do not see any progress since 5 years with this, but let's wait and see and watch it, what will happen. So there is something, always possible. So we should not take it for granted. This will continue for the next 50 years. To have an eye on these developments makes absolutely sense, and I would encourage to continue this discussion after this session because this remains an issue. Thank you.
Okay, we have one more comment.
So that's actually the reason why we have those sessions at ICANN meetings on emerging identifiers, and DOA was one of the sessions that we discussed. And one of the things that came out in the study that I made on the technology is really a deployment challenge, where we try to get browsers to adopt their interface, their programming interface, to query directly DOA resolvers, and they didn't get much traction there. So as a result, they are doing, recommending to do a DOA resolution using a proxy, using web and DNS. So somehow really hinders the deployment. There are other technologies that we looked at, like Froggens or like blockchains, and some of them have either scaling issues or they have the same bootstrapping problem. So I think you're absolutely right. We need to keep an eye on those things because sometimes maybe something new will happen, so it's important to look at it. But right now, every single one that we have looked at had run into this bootstrapping problem and couldn't find a convincing solution to it.
Okay, I haven't forgotten. Gregory wanted to add something on the alternative DNS, and as he has got trouble kind of speaking up, I'm handing over to him.
Very, very quickly, just to say that from the law enforcement perspective, we're also very worried about potential alternative DNS. We've seen over the last 2-3 years a number of malware family that were developed exclusively on domains in .bit, for instance. And we're really studying carefully the development of that new trends because we've got no idea on how to take down those domains. And if they're developing the malware family, then at some point it will probably be in the mainstream DNS.
Thank you very much, Greg. And now.
Back to Wolfgang and a bit what Alain said. Careful choice of words there. That indeed the bootstrapping problem, the system that is proposed as an alternative to DNS currently completely relies on the DNS to do its work. So I don't see how we're gonna break that system. But yeah, maybe something will change somewhere in 20 years or so. But for now, it looks very much depending on DNS. It's gonna be a tough challenge to replace it.
Okay, do we have any other comments? People raising their hands whom I'm not seeing? Peter. Oh yes, Peter.
The odd chance of getting the pre-final words. I was going to say that we've talked about lots of problems and potential issues and alternatives and so on and so forth. What we should have in mind, though, is that this system has been in place for 35 plus years, is highly distributed, is highly scalable with no alternative in sight, and has a very distributed, inclusive, or a number of, I should say, a number of different policy-making processes and fora, like ICANN for the GTLDs and the various fora for the respective fora for the CCTLDs, and a multitude of operators, despite the fact that there might be or is a trend towards concentration, and highly cooperative and is working so that we are discussing from the, say, luxury of a working system, just to avoid bad headlines. Thank you.
Okay, I've been allowed back on the microphone. I think we are, and as Lauren has mentioned, nearing time. I think what would be useful to do is maybe have some quick last words from each of the panelists we've had here. And then we'll also hear from Jana, who's been taking some key messages, keynotes from the session. If we sort of read those out before the end, make sure no one has any strong objections or changes to make there. So Alex, I guess maybe kick off with you.
I think actually Peter summed it up really nicely. What I want to say is that the system is really complex. The system of DNS governance, I would say, including all the players who have a word in this field. But it will, very simply, I think it will work as long as it makes sense. As soon as it doesn't make sense for the majority or the overwhelming majority of the users which could make that switch, it will happen. That's it. And I'm taking advantage of this moment. I probably will do this little plug. It just occurred to me that we actually have a specific event looking at this very issue of what's the future of DNS in July. It's called ICANN DNS Symposium, IDS. 13th of July. So some of you might want just to listen online unless you're going to IETF, because it will look at what actually has happened to DNS 35 years plus and what's out there. It's a technical event. So that might be interesting to follow. It's fairly academic, so it would be good to see what the insights are there. But otherwise, in DNS, we trust.
Okay, Greg, final words and plugs.
Yes, very quickly. Again, I think that DNS is an ecosystem that works very well. As Peter said, it's been there for 35 years. It's working fine. It's being amended in an incremental manner by the community, and that's great. But I think we should really spend a bit more effort as well to study not the technical vulnerabilities, but ways of which those technical specs can be misused by criminals, and try to develop other technical solutions like DNSSEC to try to plug in these holes in the system. That's on the technical aspect. And then on the policy side, I still need, and I repeat, I still think that there is room to increase the anti-abuse best practices from the registry and the registrar side. I think everyone will be safer if we were to have a more hygienic registration type of policy, which would prevent a little bit the abuse. Thank you.
Peter, you're done? David, did you want to have any final words?
I'm happy that we have more or less common ideas how should DNS work in future. But I think I mean that we all agree that we don't need any alternatives of the DNS, and it's difficult to imagine any alternative which can work as good as DNS works today. And it works for more than 30 years, and it's difficult to. There is the challenge of the security aspects concerning DNS, and I think this is connected with awareness of this, and I think the security is improving security of DNS, and DNS abuse is the key important thing in future.
Okay, thank you all. I think Jana has some key messages maybe drafted.
Okay, is it on? Yeah. Okay, so a lot was being said, and I was trying to combine all of it, but I'm sorry, I don't think they will be really good already. But I tried to, so there were 3 main themes today: complexity, stability in flight, and security. So even though the DNS system is old, it remains a vital component of the internet infrastructure. The question is how to keep the DNS system resilient and find a balance between adding new features and compromising the existing stability. Yeah, yes, no.
Okay.
Okay-ish. Yeah, the second point was on the security aspect. Encryption and strengthening security measures are important, but we need to be aware of the double-edged sword. More security also poses challenges for the law enforcement and preventing abuse, DNS abuse. The key is to find how to gradually reduce the rate of abuse, but not stifle competition and DNS functionality. And the third one, I didn't really, a beneficial next step would be to find how to measure the problem over time in order to recognize the overall trend in abusing the TLDs and to use this as an input for potential policy making.
Okay, thank you very much. Looking around the room, I haven't seen any objections, and to me those sound like...
Or if something was missed.
Or if something was missed, I'll throw it open. Yeah, Pani.
I would like to highlight the centralization issue as well.
Okay.
Can we perhaps leave that with Jana to integrate maybe something, some language?
It was my 4th point, but I didn't manage to make it into a full line. Yes.
Okay, well, I think we can assume it will make it into the final version then. Okay, so Lauren, I'll hand back to you maybe to close it.
Okay, so it seems we have no further comments. No, excellent. Okay.
We managed not to talk about GDPR.
Yes. And I think no one said the word "who is," I believe. So that's also an achievement. So thank you all very, very much for coming. In particular, obviously, to our key participants who accepted our invitation to speak. So this was Alexandra, Greg, Peter, and David. And we would also like to thank the kind of organizing committee that helped us kind of putting all of this together in a lot of very interesting calls. So again, thank you very much for coming. And now you can all get ready because we will be expected elsewhere very soon.